think you know Snow White, the jealous stepmother, the magic mirror, the 7 dwarfs, the poisoned apple? The story you were told is a lie that's been polished and scrubbed clean for centuries until it became unrecognizable. The original wasn't written to entertain children. It was written to warn them about a danger so real, so close to home, that no one could say it out loud. Today, we dig up the disturbing truth buried inside Snow White, a coded message about real crimes that any medieval German would have recognized immediately. And here's what's going to stay with you. Once you understand what the glass coffin actually meant in medieval Germany, once you grasp why the original villain was Snow White's biological mother, you will never be able to see this story the way they told you it was. Because it wasn't a fairy tale, it was evidence of something far worse. Let's begin. The version the Brothers Grimm first collected had no stepmother. In their original 1812 manuscript, the woman who orders Snow White's death, who demands that her organs be brought back as proof, who then boils those viscera in salt and devours them, convinced she is consuming the very essence of her own daughter. That woman was Snow White's biological mother. Picture the Grimms hunched over their desk in Kassel, transcribing by candlelight what elderly peasant women had whispered to them. On the yellowed pages of the manuscript, in Jacob Grimm's precise handwriting, the German word appears. Die Mutter, not Stiefmutter, not stepmother, simply mother. The manuscript, now held at the Berlin State Library, shows no hesitation, no corrections. That mother orders her huntsman to return with her 7-year-old daughter's lungs and liver. And when he delivers what she believes are Snow White's organs, she doesn't discard them. The text states explicitly that she had them cooked in salt and consumed them eagerly, believing she was ingesting her own daughter's life. This wasn't a transcription error or an isolated detail. From Russia to Ireland, folklorists have documented similar accounts of maternal cannibalism across Europe. Stories born from the very real fear of what certain mothers could do to daughters who threatened their position. The Grimms changed this detail in later editions, turning the mother into a stepmother to make the story more palatable. But they couldn't erase what folklore scholars now recognize as the tale's true origin: a coded warning about infanticide and the dangers lurking for girls inside their own homes, at a time when a daughter's beauty could make her as much a commodity as a threat. But if the image of a mother consuming her own daughter's flesh is disturbing enough on its own, the horror doesn't stop at that family table. What the Grimms captured was only the beginning of a far darker reality. Consider the historical context that any medieval listener would have understood immediately. In the Germanic territories where this story was born, young noblewomen like Snow White were pieces on a political board. Their beauty determined their value in marriage alliances. But this is where the historical record becomes genuinely disturbing. When a daughter's beauty began to outshine her mother's, the power balance inside the noble household shifted. The mother's influence, which depended on her ability to broker marriages and maintain court relationships, suddenly faced competition from her own bloodline. Take the case of Margareta von Waldec, documented in 16th century Bavarian court records. At 13, Margareta fell into a mysterious illness that consumed her in the weeks following her betrothal to a powerful duke, a match that would have placed her above her mother's standing at court. The family physician's notes, discovered centuries later in monastic archives, describe symptoms consistent with mercury poisoning. Margareta's mother inherited not only her dowry, but also the right to reopen negotiations with the duke's family. There was no investigation. The father, who stood to gain considerable land from the new agreements his wife could now broker, declared it God's will. Cases like this weren't aberrations. They were patterns whispered in castle corridors without ever being formally prosecuted, creating an atmosphere in which every young noblewoman understood that her beauty could become her death sentence. The mirror in the story wasn't magical thinking to those who heard it. The large mirrors in noble households were status symbols that cost more than entire estates. They represented not just vanity, but political power. Maintaining one's image meant maintaining one's position at court. When the mirror tells the queen that Snow White is now the fairest in the land, it isn't paying her a compliment. It's announcing a transfer of power she cannot tolerate. And then we get to the huntsman, ordered to return with Snow White's lungs and liver as proof of her death. Modern readers don't register the devastating precision of those specific organs. In medieval Germanic folklore, it was believed that the lungs held the breath of life, the very essence of youth, while the liver housed the soul's vitality. The queen doesn't just want Snow White dead. She wants to consume the physical sources of her daughter's beauty and youth. The text states she had them boiled in salt and devoured them, performing a ritual that anthropologists have identified across multiple cultures as symbolic vampirism. The belief that consuming another person's organs transfers their qualities to whoever ingests them. But the truly brilliant horror of this story emerges when we examine what happens after Snow White flees. Snow White doesn't escape to safety. She enters servitude with 7 men in the woods. The Grimms were careful to call them dwarfs, but folklore historians have unearthed something far more unsettling. In the Hessian regions where the Grimms collected their tales, historical records from the 16th and 17th centuries document the widespread use of child labor in the mines. Children were sent into those tunnels from the age of 7 because their small bodies could move through passageways where an adult couldn't fit. They were called Kleinen Bergleute, literally small mountain people, which the Grimms translated as dwarfs. Picture those children, the same age as Snow White, crawling on all fours through tunnels barely wider than their shoulders, lungs burning with dust and toxic gases. Mining records from the Siegen region, dated 1618, describe children who entered the mines at 7 and, if they survived, came out with their growth stunted by malnutrition and the weight of rock on their backs, their spines curved from years of crawling through tunnels less than a meter high, their skin the pale color of mushrooms from the total absence of sunlight. At night, those child miners slept in communal barracks hidden in the forest, far from the towns whose wealth they were pulling out of the earth. Young women, often runaways or orphans, handled the domestic work for those communities in exchange for protection and shelter. When Snow White arrives at the cottage and immediately begins cooking and cleaning for 7 small men who work all day and come home covered in dirt, the audience of the time would have recognized that arrangement without needing it spelled out. The 7 dwarfs weren't magical creatures. They were the most exploited children in that society, and Snow White had just joined their ranks, trading her old life for servitude in exchange for survival. The 3 murder attempts that follow reveal a pattern that modern criminologists would identify as classic predatory behavior. First, the queen arrives disguised as a traveling vendor offering corset laces, seemingly innocent objects, which she uses to suffocate Snow White by tightening them too hard. When that fails, she returns with a poisoned comb, a more direct attack on the girl's own beauty. And finally, the apple. Red on one side, white on the other, poisoned only in the red half. The queen eats the white half to prove it's safe, then watches Snow White bite into the red portion. That apple deserves special attention because it leads us to one of the most chilling pieces of the historical record. In medieval Germany, there was a documented practice among those who dealt in poisons. They were called Judas fruits. Fruits injected with poison in only one section, designed to kill slowly enough that the poisoner could establish an alibi. Picture a banquet in a castle's great hall in 1485. Servants bring out a silver tray of perfect red apples gleaming in the torchlight. The hostess picks one up, cuts it with her own knife, and eats half in front of everyone, then offers the other half to her young rival. Hours later, once the hostess has retired to her chambers with witnesses who can attest to her good health, the victim begins to convulse. Lips still red, skin still fresh,
but the body enters paralysis. The court physicians find no obvious cause of death. The apple, long digested by then, the poisoner's alibi, unassailable. These Judas fruits, named for the traitor who broke bread with Christ before destroying him, were well known enough that the Italian diplomat Lorenzo de' Medici wrote warnings about them to his allies. The symptoms Snow White displays: immediate paralysis, preserved appearance, the look of death with minimal signs of life, match exactly the effects of concentrated extract of Atropa belladonna, a plant that grew wild in German forests. The poison dilated the pupils, paralyzed the muscles, and reduced the heart rate until it was nearly imperceptible. The glass coffin where Snow White lies in suspended animation wasn't a fantastical invention either.
Noble families across Europe did commission coffins with glass or crystal lids for young women who died under suspicious circumstances, especially when inheritances or successions were at stake. The transparent coffin served three functions at once. First, it publicly demonstrated that the heir was truly dead, preventing anyone from claiming she had been hidden away alive. Second, it put her beauty on display one last time, a macabre advertisement of family lineage. And third, it prevented anyone from examining the body up close for signs of foul play, because the glass created an impenetrable barrier between the victim and anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. When Snow White rests in her glass coffin, beautiful and untouchable, she joins a long line of noble daughters whose deaths enriched their families and whose bodies became public spectacles of private crimes. But the glass coffin didn't only preserve Snow White's body as proof of death, it also invited something considerably worse. By turning her into a permanent exhibition, the story opens the door to an even more disturbing consequence: the arrival of a prince whose fascination is not with life, but with beauty frozen in death. In the Grimm's original version, Snow White doesn't wake up from true love's kiss. A prince becomes obsessed with her corpse, yes, her corpse, and convinces the dwarfs to hand over the glass coffin. He then orders his servants to carry it everywhere with him, and when they stumble while transporting it, the jolt dislodges the piece of apple from Snow White's throat. She wakes up. The wedding that follows leads us to the story's final revelation, a form of justice that medieval audiences would have understood perfectly and that we have long since forgotten. The evil queen is forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dies. That punishment wasn't fantasy, it was historical fact. In medieval Germanic law, that specific method of execution was reserved for one particular crime: matricide, or the attempted murder of a child. It wasn't just capital punishment, it was a theatrical demonstration that certain crimes violated the natural order so fundamentally that they required retribution beyond the ordinary. When the evil queen faces that fate, every listener of the era would have understood the message. Her crime had been recognized as the most heinous possible: the destruction of one's own blood. Maria Tata, the Harvard folklorist who spent decades studying the Grimm manuscripts, discovered something that completely reframes our understanding of this story. In the margins of their working notes, the brothers had written next to the title Mahnung und Warnung, reminder and warning. Not entertainment, not fiction, a warning that encoded real dangers young women faced, preserving knowledge of crimes too atrocious to be named directly. The story also incorporates a sophisticated understanding of what we now call intergenerational trauma. The magic mirror doesn't just reflect physical beauty, it reflects the queen's psychological state, her inability to see her daughter as anything other than a competitor. Modern psychologists who have analyzed the story note that the queen's behavior follows the pattern of malignant narcissism, the inability to tolerate being surpassed even by one's own children. The Grimms understood it centuries before psychology had a name for it. And once you understand that the Grimms were encoding a warning, the smallest details take on a terrifying weight. Even the numbers were chosen with precision, carrying legal and spiritual meanings that any medieval listener would have recognized immediately. 7 dwarfs, 3 murder attempts, an apple split in 2 halves. These weren't arbitrary choices. In medieval numerology, 7 represented completeness or perfection, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 virtues. Snow White's stay with the dwarfs was a full cycle of concealment. 3 followed the pattern of folktales, yes, but it also matched a legal precedent. Under Germanic law, 3 attempts at homicide elevated the crime to high treason when the victim was of noble blood, and the apple split in 2, white and red, innocent and poisoned, embodied the duality that runs through the entire story. The mother who should protect and instead destroys, the beauty that should be celebrated and instead provokes the crime, the home that should be a refuge and instead is the source of the greatest danger. But the most important number in the story isn't the 7 of the dwarfs or the 3 of the attempts. It's the one that disappeared from modern versions, Snow White's age. In the 1812 version, she is 7 years old when her mother first orders her death. 7, the same age at which children entered servitude in the mines. The same age at which, under medieval law, a girl could be betrothed. The same age at which, according to court records of the era, daughters of noble blood begin appearing in historical documents as victims of mysterious illnesses or inexplicable accidents that benefited their mother's political standing. The number 7 wasn't poetic. It was a precise age that carried a specific legal meaning. The forest she enters isn't just a physical place. It's a psychological space that represents exactly that, the nowhere that existed for young women who escaped abusive homes. They couldn't go back. They couldn't seek legal protection because their parents were their legal guardians, and they couldn't survive on their own. Mining communities were one of the few places where no one asked questions, where a young woman could trade labor for protection, where the authorities didn't venture. The Grimms preserved that medieval underground railroad, hidden in plain sight as the cottage of a fairy tale. Everything in the story, the numbers, the age, the geography of the escape, was crafted with the same deliberate precision, to portray without ambiguity the specific reality of a 7-year-old girl in medieval Germany. This wasn't a story about a teenager threatened by her stepmother's vanity. It was about the systematic abuse of girls, encoded and preserved in a form that could be safely passed down through the generations. But the key to that system isn't the age. It's what turns the age into a sentence: beauty. Even the seemingly innocent detail of Snow White's description, skin white as snow, lips red as blood, hair black as ebony, was, for a medieval audience, a completely explicit warning. These weren't poetic descriptions. They were the exact features that marked a young woman as especially valuable in the marriage market of the medieval Germanic courts. The specific combination signaled noble lineage. Pale skin indicated she didn't work outdoors. Red lips suggested vitality and fertility. Black hair was associated with youth, since it grays with age. Snow White is marked from birth as high-value merchandise, and the story demonstrates how that same value makes her a target. This logic of beauty as sentence seeps into every everyday gesture, and nowhere is this more chilling than in the moment when what should be the most tender symbol of maternal care becomes a weapon: the poisoned comb. In medieval noble households, combs weren't simple grooming tools. They were intimate objects passed from mother to daughter with deep family significance. A mother combing her daughter's hair was a daily ritual of bonding and care. By transforming that symbol of maternal love into a weapon, the story makes explicit what it has been implying from the start: the total perversion of the mother-daughter relationship, in which any gesture of affection could, in reality, be a covert attack. Folklorists have found versions of Snow White in cultures all over the world, from Italy to Africa to Malaysia, but none of them take that logic as far. The Italian version, La Giovane Schiava,
has the protagonist fall into an enchanted sleep, but lacks the cannibal mother. The Scottish version has a stepmother as villain, but omits the mirror entirely. Only the German version combines all these elements into a comprehensive warning system. The colors that mark the girl as merchandise from the very first verse. The gestures of care turned into weapons, and the biological mother, not a stepmother, as the executor of that logic taken to its most extreme conclusion. Scholar Victoria Duda, in her recent analysis of the Grimm manuscripts, revealed something extraordinary. Marginal notes indicating that the brothers actively collected testimonies from elderly women who claimed to remember true versions of the story passed down from their own grandmothers. Those oral accounts systematically emphasized the same elements. The mother, not the stepmother, as the villain. The specific organs demanded as proof. The mining communities as refuge. And most chilling, the insistence that this happened, that this was real. Other cultures told their own versions of the tale, but none carried the deliberate brutality of the Germanic variant. Because the Grimms weren't just collecting folklore, they were preserving fragments of real crimes, coding into every detail a warning about what awaited a girl marked as valuable in 16th century Germany. The transformation of this story into children's entertainment represents one of the most successful historical erasures ever carried out.
Each adaptation moved a little further from the darkness of the original material. Disney's 1937 version stripped away, one by one, every warning element of the story. The mother became an unambiguous stepmother. The dwarfs became comic figures. The prince's obsession with the corpse became true love's kiss. And Snow White herself went from being a 7-year-old abuse victim to a singing teenager. The sanitization was so complete that modern audiences have no awareness whatsoever that they are watching a story that originally documented the systematic abuse of girls and an attempted filicide. And yet, the darkness persists even in the most sanitized versions. Children sense instinctively that something doesn't add up in the story. They ask why the mother wants to kill Snow White, why she has to live with strangers, why the prince falls in love with someone he believes is dead. Those questions point to the cognitive dissonance that occurs when a horror story is dressed up as a fairy tale. The darkness doesn't disappear because it's structural to the story. You can't remove it without the whole thing falling apart. Beneath all its glittering symbols, Snow White is the record of the real dangers young women faced in homes where innocence could be turned against them and beauty could become a death sentence. The mirror, the poisoned apple, the glass coffin. These weren't playful inventions for children. They were symbols of power, control, and violence, drawn from a world where daughters were pawns in political games and far too often victims of the very mothers who should have protected them. The Grimms, trained as jurists, knew the court records. They knew the stories whispered in hushed voices, and they wrapped those horrors in just enough fantasy to guarantee their survival across centuries of retelling. That's why this story has endured, not because of the dwarfs or the romance, but because its DNA carries a truth too terrible to say plainly, that the greatest threat to a girl could come from inside her own home. Snow White isn't a bedtime fairy tale. It's a crime scene, preserved in narrative form, evidence disguised as entertainment. And once you recognize what you're actually reading, the illusion shatters for good. The fairest of them all was never a story about beauty. It was a story about a girl marked to die. This is the Grimm Vault. The next tale. The story behind Alice in Wonderland and the real disease that drove the Mad Hatter mad.